you everybody for joining us today. We are in our September webinar talking about the different options for care. There's quite a few options. How do you know which one is needed? How do you know where to go? So we're going to try to help point you in the right direction and give you some answers today. So let me introduce our speakers today. We are joined today, we're very pleased to have a guest speaker with Suzanne McNamara. Suzanne is joining us from Kinship Elder Care. She is an elder care manager with over 20 years experience. She is also a registered nurse and a social worker. She has medical knowledge and background necessary to give high-level care management services. She also has the compassion and understanding needed to care for the complex emotional needs of her clients and families. So, Suzanne, thank you for joining us today. And then we also have Kathleen Summers. Kathleen is our, co-founding partner of Generations Law Group. She's our lead attorney in all things elder law and estate planning. So I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne and Kathleen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We've got a nice group. Obviously, this is a topic of great interest to everyone, and one I know that's of great interest to Suzanne and myself. Suzanne, thank you again for joining us. Again, Suzanne is an aging life care advocate. She brings an incredible wealth of knowledge to this area. When we oftentimes get, clients, either clients themselves or family members who come into the office and are talking now about, what maybe do next steps look like, particularly when we're thinking about what next steps look like for living options and care options. So today we really want to go through what kind of an overview of what these living options are. So a little bit of a difference of the different types of options that are out there. And then talk about what you or loved one should be looking for when making some determinations about what's the best options for you moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and start if I could. And Suzanne and I are going to kind of go back and forth in this and hopefully provide you all with a little bit of our expertise and experience in dealing with these different things. So one of the first things that I often hear from clients is when they begin to talk about the different options that are out there for living communities and not really understanding the differences between them. Suzanne, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about a few, and then we can go forward from there.
Absolutely. So if you were to, open up Google and Google senior housing or senior living, you would get an abundance of results, right? And they would be all over the map because it's sort of a confusing and nuanced area. And it can be pretty overwhelming to start the search from step one. So it's really important to know the differences in sort of all the housing options. So all the way from home care to skilled nursing facility, there's all these places in between, all this language in between. And so it's really important to know what you're actually looking for. There's sort of general senior housing, over 55 communities. There's independent living facilities. There's assisted living facilities. There's these giant campuses, which are continuing care retirement communities, CCRCs. There's standalone assisted living buildings. There's skilled nursing facilities, and they all operate a little bit differently. Payment structure is different. Level of care that they accept is different. So you really have to make yourself knowledgeable somehow, whether it's speaking to an expert or doing your own research on what those different facilities offer, what they mean, who they accept, and how you pay for it. So it's quite overwhelming, and there's a lot out there.
Absolutely. And sometimes I'll hear people come in and talk about, well, my loved one, we want to have this individual move into an assisted living. They'd like to go into that type of care community. Another thing that we always have to look at, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is when we're looking at, how do you pay for it, as Suzanne said, and what is your need with respect to level of care? Because that is oftentimes kind of an entry point for many of these different communities as to what exactly are your needs and can that community meet those needs. So critical that you understand the difference between these things. Like senior housing, oftentimes we talk about, having families who are thinking about moving, an individual who's thinking about moving but wants to stay within their own community. Remember, these senior housing options oftentimes have very extensive waiting lists within the communities. And so it's important that you begin to look at these things sooner than later if you can. I know, Suzanne, I'm not sure you have the same experience, but oftentimes someone will talk about going into an assisted living type facility or community. And again, sometimes we have them, they're waiting too long before they actually make the decision to do that. And that option may no longer be available to them. So really, the sooner you can begin to look at these different communities, understand what your needs are and what they can offer, the more choice I think you have in the end in terms of which type of community you might want to be able to utilize.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I oftentimes, my clients are usually in their 80s and 90s, and I oftentimes have adult children sort of joke about the fact that they should start thinking about it. And then I say, no, really, you should. And not to think about moving if you're, 40, 50, 60, 70, but to know what you're looking at, both financially and care-wise, and what your goals are.
Yeah. Suzanne, I think that's a great point. Looking doesn't mean making a decision. It means educating yourself. Absolutely. 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 So talking a little bit about this, and when we are looking at the different options that are out there, Suzanne, talking a little bit about how people make a determination of what kind of community is best for them.
Sure. So varying level of need, obviously, right? With the elders in your life. So there are some folks that might just need the structure of a day. Maybe it's just too much to keep up their house, to make all their meals, to do their laundry, strip their bed, all that kind of thing. They may just need a structure of the day and maybe a little bit of help with some meal planning. That's very different than looking at someone who is perhaps wheelchair bound and needs one or two people to help get them up out of bed, on and off a chair, maybe need someone to push them in a wheelchair. Varying levels of care, and you really need to be dialed in on what level of care your loved one requires so that you know where they could be. I have a client that just contacted me last week whose loved one is in a rehab facility, and they've toured 5 or 6 assisted livings. And I went to see this client, and I can say, pretty much 95% with, clarity that this client is not going to meet the level of care that assisted living can handle. So, before you start touring places and calling places, really understanding where, what makes the most sense in terms of where to focus your attention. Location and budget are also big sticking points. So knowing how to pay for these places. So I have a lot of folks that come to me and say, okay, my mom has, Medicare and MedX and this great policy, and perhaps they are a veteran and they have this great health insurance, and that should cover things, right? Unfortunately, no. The vast majority of long-term care is paid for privately, unless someone runs out of funds and has to spend down and go to a state level. The vast majority of long-term care, whether it's at home, in an assisted living, in a continuing care retirement community, it's all private pay, meaning you have to have the funds to pay for it yourself. So that's also something that comes into play in a big way when thinking about where you or your loved one could go.
Absolutely. And I wanted to just mention on the level of care, oftentimes we don't always do our own good assessment on that, whether we're doing it for ourselves or whether we're doing it for our loved ones. I always joke a little bit. I know when I was raising my children and I would need to take them to the doctor's office, they always miraculously got so much better on the trip to the doctor. And I think all of us, when we go to see our healthcare professionals, we oftentimes present our best selves, or we're seeing our family when we haven't seen them for a while. And so having someone, and not to plug Suzanne, but I'm certainly going to, because I think the services that she provides, one of the wonderful things about having a professional such as she involved in this whole process is that she can really do an independent, clear assessment and give some real clarity about what level of care is going to be required, and talk a little bit more about some of the things that should be thought about with respect to level of care. And when we're talking about the budget and how things are paid for, again, this is a critical aspect, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But don't make presumptions. You know, for instance, those of you who are around this area, and I know we have, you know, some more kind of affluent communities that may have an assisted living or continuing care community. Don't make presumptions about how their fee structure works. Go talk with them. Go find out, because some of these communities do have programs to help with people who may not have the same level of income as others. It's not all of them. You need to ask these questions, but definitely ask. Don't make a presumption that I can't afford it, or this is something that's not going to be within my reach. Find out, get the information.
Absolutely.
So let's begin by talking a little bit about how you start looking at some of these potential communities in terms of determining what's best for you or your loved one.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about a place other than home, and that can be a whole nother conversation too, right? Some folks say, I want to stay in my home no matter what, which is doable for the most part if you have the financial ability to get some care in the home. But when thinking about outside the home, when thinking about living somewhere else, there's a lot of factors that come into play, and it's a very independent, subjective decision. So I often have people come to me and say, I want you to give me a list of the best nursing homes in the area. I want you to give me a list of the best assisted livings in the area. And I always say to people, well, before I give you any list or talk to you about anything, I need to sit down and talk to you and get to know you and your loved one to see what matters to you, because it truly depends on what your goals are. There are assisted living communities that allow pets. Is that something that's important to you? Some don't. There are assisted living communities that are right downtown in the middle of a city where you could walk to a coffee shop, where you could walk to a bookstore, where you could walk on a walking path. There's other assisted livings that are in the woods in a beautiful setting, but you could never get anywhere unless you had a car. You know, same with sort of independent living and retirement communities. There are some that when you visit them and when you talk to the people, they're a lot more focused on things like lifelong learning, taking classes, teaching classes, that kind of thing. Others are more focused on, you know, fitness, well-being, you know, physical health. You also need to look at the community. What's important to you and what do they have there? Some of the independent livings have big, beautiful Olympic-sized pools. Some of them have big exercise rooms. Some of them have, you know, movie theaters. What matters to you and your loved ones? Also, you know, speaking to folks in your area and other family members or friends that have had to go through this, I find is really helpful for people. There's sort of once you start talking about this, it sort of opens the door with people to say, oh, I had this experience here. I had this experience here. Take it into account, but I always tell people to do your own research and visit your own facilities, because it is so very subjective. Even aesthetically speaking, you know, some of the communities are a bit older and they have a bit of an older feel. You might like that. Some of them are brand new and shiny and granite everywhere, and they look like a 5-star hotel. Is that important to you? Maybe. Talk to them about the staff. Talk to them about how long the staff has been there. Talk to them about what activities are available. You know, one of the biggest things for people when considering moving into a community like an assisted living or a continuing care retirement community is often the activities, right? Because these communities are non-medical. So an assisted living or a CCRC or independent living, they're non-medical. They're socially focused. So it's really important to see what the other residents are doing, see what folks are doing on the campus. Are they actively involved in activities? Is there entertainment? Do they have transportation? Are they taking their residents places? All of those things. But in doing your research, know that it is incredibly subjective and it is very personal. And so you really should talk to someone about sort of what your goals are in moving. What do you want to get out of this? And then you can sort of narrow it down to some places that you should tour and talk to.
I love it. Thank you. And, you know, sometimes again, in looking at what's important to you, I've had clients who have thought about, you know, settings that might meet a specific religious desire. I've had others who, you know, talk about, as you said, activity levels being a certain way, or not necessarily wanting to participate in activities, and being able to weigh that. I think the other thing that you talked about, Suzanne, that is really important is understanding the difference between a medically based community and a non-medically based community. And that can be a huge difference in terms of how things are paid for. For instance, Medicaid or Mass Health here in Massachusetts, those are really, that's for a focus on the medically based facilities, like a skilled nursing facility. So it's important to understand whether your needs are more from the social, the, you know, psychosocial, having community, and what your, again, going back to what your needs level are, or are you needing a community that has a much higher focus on medical needs? Right.
Yeah, and
So,
just as an, sorry, Kathleen.
No, go ahead.
Just as an aside, that is always something I focus on with my clients too, because oftentimes families are under the impression, you know, that once mom moves into an assisted living, oh gosh, everything's going to be taken care of and that's great, and everything's going to be off our plate. I always like to just caution people that, you know, communities, there's wonderful things about many of these communities, but when you're talking about a social model and a non-medical model, it is more of a safety net. And so there is still a large responsibility on the individual and or family to sort of manage their own medical needs still. So although there are nurses at most of these communities, the nurses are limited in what they can do clinically. They're more there for sort of a coordination of care, but there is still a large amount of responsibility for yourself or your loved one to be able to manage their own medical oversight. That's not taken over by a community. And I always like to sort of to sort of warn people of that, because oftentimes you go on these tours and they say wonderful things and they mean them and they follow through with them, but you sort of, it can get mixed up and you sort of think everything's taken care of, when there still needs to be a level of independence in terms of oversight, you know, medically, when you're in a socially based community.
Absolutely. I think that's a critical thing for people to remember, because we oftentimes, and you know, no slight on the communities, they try to present their best selves, and in terms of what they believe you're going to want and that their community wants and needs. But you really need to be clear about what is going to be provided, what's going to be provided at what cost, again, going back to budget, because oftentimes these communities can provide more support, but you're also going to pay for more support.
Right.
So critical to understand what is being offered on a basic level, what you're paying for in terms of kind of, I almost think of it as a landlord-tenant relationship with some of these communities. What is it that they're providing you on that basic level? And then what is provided additionally, but at an additional cost?
Correct. It's very
Suzanne,
about that.
Suzanne talked a lot about this already in terms of some of the things to look at when you're visiting a community. I always tell people, and I love this one, about going at different times for the community, because things are very different at different times, you know, particularly when we're looking at the medically based communities like skilled nursing facilities or nursing homes. The daytime tends to be a much more active time, people doing things. You're going to want to see what life is like in that community as well, in the off hours, maybe in the evening, maybe on weekends, particularly if you're looking at staff levels and who's there to be able to help provide support and what type of support is being provided.
Yes.
I also like to tell people, go for a meal when you can. So, you know, find out about the food. Food's important. And oftentimes it's a big part of what's being offered in any of these different communities to help support us as we age. And so you want to make sure that you like the meal that's being provided.
Right. And I say this sometimes, and I say it cautiously, hoping there's no, you know, executive director of a skilled nursing facility. Sometimes if you just show up for a tour, you get, you know, if there is someone available to give you a tour, you get a better sense of what's really happening. And that's more for a skilled nursing facility. For an assisted living community, you really need to set up a tour. And obviously advance notice, anyone prefers that. But if you stop by a skilled nursing facility without a tour, you might get turned away and say, there's nobody here right now that can help you. That might happen. And that's, you know, that's reality. Staffing is tough everywhere, and that's not a slight on them either. But if there is someone to show you around quickly, you're getting sort of a firsthand look without them knowing that you're coming. And it can sort of just give you a you know, insight into everyday life there. So again,
Exactly.
new administrators here that are hearing me say that, but you know, advance notice is better. But if you do just stop by and there's someone there, you can sort of see what's happening and what life is like.
Right. Because this is where you or your loved one is going to be living, and you do want to see, you know, things like cleanliness. You know, you walk into a facility, is there an odor? These are all things that you do want to look at. And again, there will always be one-offs on certain things, you know, things happen. But you do want to get a sense for what the overall is for this facility. And is it a one-off, or is it something that is kind of a really, you know, what's happening in the facility on a day-to-day basis?
Right.
Really getting a feel for that overall atmosphere when you can. And one of the things, if I could just interject really quickly, is sometimes we're faced with these decisions in a crisis. And
Right.
that's the part that I'm always trying to help clients and their loved ones avoid where possible. The more education about these communities you can get ahead of time, the better off it will be that if a crisis occurs, you do have a more clear idea of where you would want to end up living, or what options would be there for your loved one, and not have to make that decision in a split second.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. And you know, 75% of the time that doesn't happen. So that's a big thing that I try to tell all of my clients is as much education beforehand you can get yourself, you know, you will benefit from that. Your loved ones will benefit from that.
Absolutely. So we did talk a little bit about this, taking a look at evaluating the range of services that are being offered, really understanding what level of healthcare, if any, is there. Suzanne had said, you know, many of the communities have, let's say, nursing on staff, but what exactly is their role? What can they do? What can't they do? And there are limitations, particularly when we're talking about assisted living, in terms of what healthcare providers can do within the community, you know, who are staff for the community. The dining options, you can all see, maybe it's lunchtime, food is on my brain, but dining options are important. You need to make sure that you understand what those are. And transportation. You know, many of these communities do offer levels of transportation so that people are encouraged to be able to still get out, do activities, maybe get to doctor's appointments and that type of thing. So understanding that.
Yeah, and check in on that transportation, because that is something that sometimes folks are moving into a community so that their transportation to doctor's appointments can be taken care of. So do your research. Just because if you see a van with the name of the community on it, you know, do your research in terms of how often is that van available? How far in advance do I need to reserve that van? You know, do I need someone to go with me, or can I just go by myself? Do your research there too, because that can be something that that folks depend on, and every community is a little bit different in terms of how they structure that. Some don't have transportation at all. Some of them just flat out don't have that as an option. So make sure to talk about that.
Right. And is there an extra cost associated with utilizing that particular service? So understanding those options are important.
Right.
Reviewing the contract and costs, and I'm sure that Suzanne's going to have some things to say about this as well, but this is one of the critical things I always tell people that you want to do. And we do have kind of if you have a chance to go on our website, we do actually have a checklist for people to be able to use when they're kind of looking at different contracts for the communities. But it is critical that you understand what services are being offered under that contract and what the cost of those services are. I cannot tell you how often I have clients come in that say, well, I thought they were going to do X, Y, and Z. I thought they were going to fill my medication boxes for me on a weekly basis. I thought that was part of the services that were offered. I thought transportation was part of the services, or some kind of medical oversight was part of the services. That is not always the case, and it is critical to understand what is that basic cost, what are you paying for, and what additional services may be available. But again, what is the cost for those services as you begin to potentially need to take advantage of them?
Absolutely. And oftentimes, you know, when you get sort of a quick overview from a sales and marketing person about a base rate, oftentimes the base rate seems very reasonable. But like Kathleen said, once you start adding on things like medication management, you know, escorts to the dining room, things that may seem small and nominal to you, you know, just someone to help you walk to the dining room. These, you know, most things come at a cost now. So understand what that base rate is, but also understand where they're going to jump to the next level. Because a lot of these facilities now, the way that they structure it is they sort of have a base level of care, and then they have some tiers of care, depending on what you or your loved one needs. You know, do you need that medication management? Do you need help taking a shower? Do you need help getting dressed? Do you need someone to escort you to the dining room? All those kinds of things. And they, you know, every facility is a bit nuanced in how they structure it. So ask those questions, because oftentimes the base rate jumps pretty quickly once you get into how much care that person really needs, how much help they really need. You know, it can go up by thousands of dollars every month. So do your research and ask those questions.
Absolutely. And Suzanne had talked on, you talked a little bit about the payment options and how most of particularly the non-medical based communities are a private pay. I guess maybe a little bit more on the brighter side is, you know, if you are a veteran, we do want to always look at that to see, can we get you additional benefits to help you or your spouse, a spouse of a veteran as well, may qualify for some additional monies to be able to help cover particularly assisted living type communities. Understanding what Medicaid or Mass Health pays for and how you go about potentially becoming eligible for that. Again, it's more typically the medical-based communities like a skilled nursing facility that you're going to find Medicaid benefits paying for. But you do want to look at that. How does this work? And is there an additional benefit I can get? Suzanne talked a little bit, and we'll touch at the end about the community-based, because we don't want to forget that staying in your home is always an option and one that we want to explore. And there can be some benefits that Mass Health or Medicaid helps to pay for under the community benefits as well. Medicare, most people think, well, I have Medicare and it's going to help pay. I want to kind of put that one right down right now. Medicare doesn't pay for an awful lot, and it doesn't pay for any kind of things associated with living. So you need to understand that. And the refund policy. So look, not all communities are going to work out for someone, or if it does work out, and certainly until someone has passed away, we want to make sure that you understand how a refund, if you've paid any kind of a deposit down, how that's handled, because oftentimes it's not just an automatic refunding of that monies. There can be a time delay in terms of getting the monies. You may have to wait until the community is able to release your apartment. So there can be many different things that come into play on that refund policy. So make sure that you understand how any refund that you or your loved ones may be due, how that ends up getting paid.
Absolutely.
So checking the credentials. So this is really for all. Although Suzanne, you may have a little bit more also to add to this. What I find is that from a legal standpoint, we're still in kind of an uncharted, even though assisted living communities have been around for decades, they're not highly regulated. And that's one of the things that you need to understand. When I say that assisted livings in particular, and even senior housing options with the different towns, these are all much more of a landlord-tenant kind of relationship. They are not highly regulated from the standpoint of care options, what's expected, as like a skilled nursing facility, a nursing home. They are much more highly regulated. They are credentialed. People who work there have to be credentialed. And so it's a very different expectation and environment. But the skilled nursing, the communities such as assisted livings don't have the same level of regulation around them. And so you need to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what makes it so subjective in some ways when you are choosing a non-medical community, because of this, because they are really not highly regulated, despite, like you said, Kathleen, the length of time that we've had these communities. So because of that, they really do all operate, in similar ways, but they're all a little bit different in the way that they operate. There's really not a specific standard of care necessarily that you can expect, which makes it really, really difficult to choose one. And it makes it really difficult, going from one community to the other. You really might get some pretty stark differences in terms of the care level that they will accept and that kind of thing, because there are no hard and fast regulations on most of the things regarding assisted living. So there's a wide variety out there of assisted living and CCRC communities. So you really have to do your research for the nursing homes, like Kathleen said. They are regulated by the state. So the state comes into every licensed nursing home every year, and they do a full report. They come in, they talk to residents, they talk to staff members, they look in charts, and, I'm dating myself now, everything's on the computer. I'm remembering the state when they would pull all the charts and they would literally sit there flipping through charts. They go in the kitchen, they go in the refrigerator, they check every aspect of the nursing home, and then they provide a report, which is available. We can put it in the chat, I'm sure, but it's available on the mass.gov website. You can go city by city, and you can look at every licensed nursing home, and you can look at their most recent state survey, their state results, and you can look at where their deficiencies were at. So nursing homes can be a little bit more objective. Still, you need to visit, and you need to feel the vibe there, but it can be a little bit easier objectively to look at a nursing home because you have something to go by. You have a number that you can look at online. And I always tell people, look at it and certainly take it into consideration. It's not necessarily the be all end all of your decision making, but certainly look at it, because if the numbers are consistently very, very low, well, that tells you something,
Right. And that's perfect. That's a perfect segue into talking about the consideration of a reputation for a community. And how do you determine that reputation? And as you said, Suzanne, there is definitely objective data out there, particularly for skilled nursing facilities. However, you also need to understand that not every kind of ding by the state, so something that they're dinging that community on, they're taking points off, has the same weight of concern and consideration as others. So you not only need to look at those numbers, but you still need to do all the rest of the work too, in terms of really, as you said, visiting the community, finding out from friends and family where you can, and working with professionals to understand what really is the reputation of this particular community, and what does it offer me that it really would interest me to want to live there.
Yeah. And I will say, when talking to friends and family about communities, to me, like I said, with the non-medical based communities, they're so subjective. Mm-hmm. But with the nursing homes, talking to friends and family, I think, hold what your friends and family say in terms of nursing homes and skilled facilities, hold that pretty close and take that to heart, because it's less subjective. Nursing homes, there are regulations they have to meet, there are requirements they have to meet. And so I feel like the weight of your friends and family's recommendations can be a little bit heavier when it comes to nursing homes and skilled facilities, because there is less subjectivity to it, right? You really need that medical oversight. You really need those staffing levels. You really need them, checking skin and making sure there's no skin breakdown and medication errors. It's a little bit more subjective. So I always tell people, if someone tells you they were at an assisted living and they didn't love it, well, it could have been because it wasn't the right setting for them. So look at it yourself. But when it comes to skilled nursing facilities, do all of your own research, take all of your own tours, but listen to what your friends and family are saying too, about reputation.
Absolutely. And one thing to remember about skilled nursing facilities is there's typically two different levels of care provided at a skilled nursing facility. There's a rehab level of care, and this is where people go in for after they've had some kind of hospitalization. They go in, let's say, for after hip surgery or some kind of rehab related to an illness that they're going to be in there for a defined period of time, usually a couple of weeks, in order to be able to get themselves back on their feet and back into their regular community home. And there's then long-term care nursing home. And those two experiences in a skilled nursing facility can be different. And so if you're looking for the long-term care portion of a skilled nursing facility, you really want to make sure that you're seeing that aspect of the facility setting.
Good point.
So, sorry, had a little, there we go. So talking about the healthcare services, we did say that usually healthcare services are really related to skilled nursing facilities, but healthcare services can be offered as well in the assisted living communities. So Suzanne, any thoughts about how people can look to evaluate that level of service?
Yeah, so when thinking about a rehab or a skilled nursing, they pretty much sort of take over your healthcare. You can think of it as, you have your primary care doctor in the community. Once you go into a skilled nursing, that higher level of care, there's a primary care doctor there that will sort of take over your needs. There are nurses there that will take your vital signs and your blood pressure and all that stuff. So your healthcare needs, by and large, are met by the skilled nursing facility. When it comes to a social model, there are a lot of differences, right? So there are some that it's literally a landlord-tenant relationship where you move in, you're paying room and board, you get your meals, you get someone to maybe deliver your medication. But other than that, you're on your own in terms of your medical needs. It's just like living in the community. You go out to see your doctor, you go out to see your specialists, anything you need, you go out for. There's other facilities, especially now, with the aging population, there are other facilities that now have a primary care team that's dedicated to their facility. So there might be a nurse practitioner that visits once a month, that comes in to see patients for primary care. There might be a podiatrist that comes once a month to see people. There might be an audiologist sometimes that visits. Some of these facilities now do have sort of a medical office set up for some of these visiting practitioners, which makes it a little bit easier for folks to, to see their team and to get their needs met. Typically, any specialist, neurologist, cardiology, anything like that, you would need to go out for. But sometimes those basics of primary care and, podiatry, audiology, sometimes they come right to the facility and you can sort of get some of your primary care done there. The nurses that are at assisted living facilities and communities, ask them what they can do. If your doctor tells you, your blood pressure's been high, I need you to check your blood pressure every day until you come back. Can they help you do that? Can the nurse there help you? Or is that something that you're going to be on your own for? Ask those questions. Ask about the accessibility. Ask if they have someone that does come there. Ask what their percentages of residents that get their primary care there. That'll give you an idea of how often those practitioners are visiting. All of those, and again, this sort of goes back to the overall that these communities are not highly regulated, so they all function a little bit differently. They're not required to have a primary care team that comes there. They're not required to have a podiatrist that visits every month. So ask those questions when visiting those communities, because it will have a big impact, especially if it's somewhere that you want to stay. Aging in place is a big deal now, right? Not having to move 3 times before the end of your life. If you're planning to stay in a community like that, ask about the access to these healthcare professionals, because it will have an impact on the rest of, the rest of the care, the rest of your loved one's life there.
Yeah, that's a great question to ask, and Suzanne's right on point, asking, what happens as I age. The other part is with the whole idea of cost associated with the community. What happens if I run out of money? What happens if? You want to ask these questions, because again, each community is going to give you a different answer. And if they answer, and oftentimes I hear it, that we don't have someone, leave just because they've run out of money, make sure you have that in writing somewhere, that is part of the information that's provided to you, because there are some communities that they have charitable arms to them, they have some kind of a bond that you pay in, whatever, that may actually make it so that if you did at some point run out of funds, they will continue to allow you to live there and continue to provide you with the same care. Again, though, do you have to move your room? Would you have to leave your apartment and go into maybe a shared apartment? These are some the things you want to ask up front.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So talking a little bit about, consulting with your legal and financial professionals, I always talk with clients about, from a legal standpoint, we want to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row. So having your power of attorney in place, having your healthcare proxy in place. You're going to find that most communities want to make sure these things are in place and they know who your important decision makers would be. Also, understanding when we're talking about the payment source for things, is Medicaid or Mass Health accepted in this particular community or facility? How do we go about getting you eligible if that's something that you're interested in? Will veterans benefits be something that you can utilize, and how do you go about planning? Because oftentimes when you first look at the situation, or you have an admissions person looking at it from the facility, they may say no, based on what's in front of them, you're not going to be able to qualify. But there may be things that you can do with your legal or your financial professional to help you become eligible at some point in the future. So you absolutely want to look at all of those different things. The other thing, again, and not to harp on it, but I am going to harp on it, is understanding the contracts with these different communities, making sure, again, that you understand exactly what it is that you're purchasing. Because particularly with assisted living communities, memory care communities, the senior housing options, you're oftentimes signing contracts related to them, and you want to make sure that you understand what services you are purchasing from that community. What are you getting? And for those of you who may be acting on behalf of another, so you're someone's power of attorney, remember when you're reviewing these documents, if your loved one no longer is able to do so for themselves, they don't have the competency, let's say, to be able to review the documents and actually engage in this kind of, contractual relationship. If you're moving forward on their behalf, remember to always sign these documents in the capacity in which you're acting. So if you're acting as a power of attorney for someone, you're signing the documents as their power of attorney. That makes sure that you're not personally taking responsibility. You are taking responsibility in your capacity as the representative for this person. And that legally is very different. You never, as a loved one, have to take responsibility financially for another. You need to make sure you're doing that correctly. And if you have any questions or concerns, speak with your attorney or your loved one's attorney to make sure you're understanding how you're signing any documents.
Yeah. I'll add, for every single client that I see and talk to, making sure that they have an elder law attorney on board is, I pretty much tell everybody it's essential, and especially if you haven't reviewed your documents in a long time. There are some people that are so prepared. They say, oh yeah, I did my power of attorney and my healthcare proxy 25 years ago. And I say, well, contact that attorney. And if that attorney is no longer practicing, contact another elder law attorney. You need to make sure everything's updated and that you have everything in place that you need, because things change.
Things do. Exactly. Suzanne, I want to let us know we've got about 15 minutes, and I know we've got some things we want to get to, so we may go a little bit quicker through these last ones. Suzanne, I want you to talk a little bit about your role and the kinds of things that an aging life care manager can do.
Sure. So I will talk quickly because I want to get to any questions that we might have, but I sort of break up my role into three major areas because it can be a bit difficult to understand what I actually do. So I have some clients that I see that just want sort of a conversation like this, maybe in a little bit more detail, depending on the situation at hand. But some people just want education. They want a roadmap. They want to know, what is an assisted living? What is a CCRC? What's a nursing home? How do I pay for it? here's my mom's needs. What do you think? And we do a deep dive, and sometimes that's it. And they say, okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go on my merry way. Then I have folks on the other end of the spectrum that I'm quite involved with, sometimes on a day-to-day basis, depending on the need. So I have some folks, and usually, I give an example of, a particular individual who I recently took care of, who was living on his own in Cambridge. Closest family member was hours away, very involved and supportive, but just, not right there next door. And this individual was pretty medically compromised and pretty medically complex, wanted to stay in his own home, was cognitively intact, but medically complex. So I helped to coordinate all of his care. So every doctor's appointment I went to, every interface with a physician or a physical therapist or a social worker, I was there. So anything coordination of care wise, I was involved in. We eventually ended up getting him 24-hour care in the form of certified nursing assistants in his home. So any questions that they would have regarding his care, they would come to me. I never serve as an emergency contact or take the place of a family member in any way, but anything related to the coordination of that person's care, I sort of become the first point of contact. And so those are the two ends of the spectrum in terms of the clients that I help. And then I do have folks in between. So because I meet people at many different aspects of their life, I might meet someone during an acute phase. For instance, I have someone right now whose mom is transitioning from a hospital to a rehab setting. And at that point, we don't know whether she'll be able to go back home. We don't know, what care level she's going to need. We don't know whether she's going to be able to afford what she needs on an ongoing basis. So for that person, I'm quite involved right now. It might be that in 2 months, when things settle down and we figure out exactly where she needs to be, it might be that I can back off, that I don't need to be quite as involved. Sometimes with those folks, it comes in waves. So sometimes I might be involved for a period of time, and then things kind of calm down and the family sort of takes over doing the management. And then a year down the road, something changes and they need me to sort of jump back in. So that's sort of what I call my in-between clients, where it just sort of waxes and wanes in terms of my involvement with them. So that was a lot of information in about 3 minutes because I want to leave time, but those are the sort of examples of my clients and how I help.
Yeah, and I find that oftentimes having the involvement of a care manager such as Suzanne really can be not only a time saver, an emotional time saver for families. It allows family members to stay family members and not become caregivers on a regular basis, and can save money in the end, because really being able to have an understanding as to how the system works, what's the options that are available, can actually be very beneficial to families in many, many ways. So we did want to have a quick discussion, and I don't mean to go through this too quickly, but talk a little bit about keeping someone at home, because we never want to forget that that is an option. And when we're talking about home, we're talking about in your own private home, whether that's a home you own, whether that be an apartment complex that you live in, and sometimes also an assisted living kind of programs to be able to support a little bit more of being able to stay at that level.
Yeah.
So again, I'm sorry, private care, and Suzanne, you do a lot with private care, and again, bringing that in and coordinating that.
Yeah.
And then community-based programs. And these are oftentimes programs that are under the Mass Health system, under Medicaid. One's called the FEW program, or the Frail Elder Waiver program. This is a program where someone who would otherwise need nursing home level care may be able to get care at home. And one is called the PACE program. The PACE is an all-inclusive healthcare program that is offered usually in off-site areas, and then the person comes back home again for the evenings. One of the great things about a PACE program is it is all-inclusive, but it does oftentimes mean that you have to make a change in terms of your healthcare providers. One thing I want to say about all these programs, and I'm sure Suzanne is also seeing that is in the private care sector, help is becoming hard to find. Good help is hard to find. Can't get an appointment with your primary care physician for 6 months, and we're having trouble also finding good qualified people to be able to provide care at home. But that's where someone like Suzanne comes in so well. So
I'm going to jump in and ask a question.
Sure.
Can you speak to some of the differences and special features of memory care specific facilities?
Sure. So memory care is certainly its own area, and there are within skilled nursing facilities and within assisted living type communities, there are often separate areas for just memory care for those with a some kind of memory diagnosis, whether it be dementia, Alzheimer's, Lewy body, Parkinson's dementia. There's all kinds of different kinds, and within many of these communities, not all have specific memory care, but with many of these communities, there is a specific area designated to just memory care. It is typically a locked facility because oftentimes with some of our more mobile memory care folks, walking away, wandering is an issue. So most of these areas are locked. And typically, what's supposed to happen in these facilities is that the activities are more geared towards those with a memory impairment. So you have your sort of traditional folks in these communities, and then you have your memory impaired folks. So the activities are geared more towards those folks with memory impairment. Sometimes the staff have a different level of training, more specific to helping care for folks with memory impairments. In some of these places, staffing levels are a little bit different, where there's a little bit better ratios between resident or patient to caregiver, just because of the needs of memory care. Oftentimes those in memory care need different kinds of interventions for, being open to receiving help with a shower or being open to receiving your medication. There's sort of a different level of care needed for these folks. So, there's often in these memory care areas, there's often an outdoor area, like a courtyard that's sort of all fenced in, that these folks can sort of come and go. So they feel that, they're not sort of trapped, even though they are within a locked environment. And like I said, not every facility has a separate memory care area, but many of them do. And most of the newer facilities that are being built now have a specific memory care area, because oftentimes, I just had a client actually last week move from the traditional side of an assisted living over to the memory care side. And it can be a little bit less of an invasion if they're just sort of moving down the hall rather than having to pack up and leave the whole facility. So you'll see memory care in many of these facilities now.
Right. And one thing, and it probably goes without saying, but I will anyway, the locked units are to protect the residents inside. They are not to lock out family members or other people who may be coming to see someone. And that should never be something that you experience when you have a loved one in a memory care unit. Other than lovely COVID years that we went through, in which we all had to deal with a different world. World.
And usually cost associated with memory care is usually higher, just as an aside. Yep.
Absolutely. So just to kind of wrap things up, again, we want to remind people, don't rush this decision. It takes time. You want to really think about it. You want to do your research, do your homework, weigh those pros and cons about the different potential communities, and within those kinds of communities, then the different options that you may have, because again, there are many different types of things like assisted livings within the assisted living world, and really trust your instinct. I mean, if the place isn't looking clean, if people aren't staying active, if you're not seeing the level of involvement that you would like to see there, then pay attention to that. Absolutely pay attention to that.
Absolutely.
Suzanne, anything else? Any last words that you may have?
I could speak about all of this for hours, but no, just, do your research, contact a professional. I always tell people, my services are all private pay, but, I'm always willing to have a 15-minute conversation, even if it's just to sort of point you in the right direction. In another life, I was very involved in the mass health world and the nonprofit world. So I do have quite a bit of knowledge about those programs like PACE that you talked about. There's all kinds of different community-based programs, and they can be nuanced too. That's a whole nother world. So I can always sort of direct people in the right place to get more information about that as well. But educate, do your research.
Wonderful. Suzanne, thank you again so much for joining us today. I hope you all have found this very helpful. I know I learned something new from Suzanne every time I speak with her, and want to thank everyone for being with us.